Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here, and thank you everyone watching from wherever you're watching. We've set up the live stream for this. I am Philip Atiba Solomon, Chair of African American Studies here at Yale University. It's my great honor to be welcoming you to the Henry Louis Gates Jr. Lecture this year in 2024 on the precipice of great decisions about democracy. Before I get started in the introduction of our esteemed guest, I have some thank yous that I'd like to read out. I want to say thank you to Daniel and Joanna Rose, who endowed this lecture, Elizabeth Alexander, to help to steward the funds, to the deans at Yale, especially Ken and Katie Lofton, to all of you for coming out, for Taylor Thompson, for shepherding our guests around today, for Valerie Akinyoyinu, for helping out with programming and the rest, and to Vanessa Epps, who handled most of the logistics. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for making life in the department possible. And of course, I could not say thank yous without thanking the namesake, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was in the audience tonight, drove down straight from class, completing the educational mission at home and now slightly abroad. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dean Larry Bobo. Lawrence D. Bobo is Dean of Social Science and the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, a man of which Du Bois would be proud. Jointly appointed in Sociology and African American Studies, he is the leading scholar of racial attitudes of his generation and possibly in the history of the nation. A Los Angeles native, now cursed to attend Celtics home games. Dean Bobo received his BA from Loyola Marymount before receiving his PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. From there, he went on to earn tenure from the University of Wisconsin, UCLA, Harvard, and Stanford before returning to Harvard. And he is a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, and he is absolutely your auntie's favorite social scientist. His list of awards takes up 2 full pages, and the list of names or invited talks he has given takes up 3.5, small font. The work that earned these accolades wrestles with a wide range of issues and provides the intellectual infrastructure necessary to grapple with the protean nature of racism in our public opinion, our policies, and our politics. His engagement with the definition of racism is, to me, amongst the most lasting intellectual legacies, providing for a generational roadmap in how we define our terms, and why that remains among the most powerful tools in a scholar's arsenal for breaking new ground on ancient topics. Now, in putting together my introductory remarks today, I was struck by the threads in Dean Bobo's work and how they foreshadow our current moment. The seriousness he brings to questions of how we think about racial attitudes, where they come from, how we should measure them, and what that means for the shift in them over time. All of that is equaled by his productive frustration with our nation's political inability to do the work to combat the negative racial attitudes we have inherited. So I thought about taking significant time to regale you all with some of those overlaps, the ways in which his early work foreshadowed things going forward, and the fact that he has the Du Bois professorship, I think, is a bit of a mirror in the same way that Du Bois's work foreshadowed what was to come. But his talk promises to do much of that work on its own, in ways that we've yet to see. I don't want to get ahead of the speaker himself on that. So instead, in the brief time, don't worry, I'm not going to take you here for the full hour, but I wanted to take a moment to thank Dean Bobo, not just for his scholarship, but also for his example as a scholar. A very, very long time ago, back in the last millennium, when I had hair, Dean Bobo was a mentor to me. It was my 3rd year in college, and I had already benefited from an embarrassment of mentors before Dean Bobo had even arrived in Cambridge. The 2 that exerted the greatest influence on me before that arrival were Cornel West and William Julius Wilson. I found myself drawn to West's cognitive virtuosity, encyclopedic grasp of theory, and connection to the lived experiences of vulnerable Black communities. And I could not resist Wilson's inescapable, relentlessly detailed quantitative assault on victim-blaming explanations for racial stratification. But the truth is, I also could not fully see how to embody both approaches in the same one life. How do you hold nihilism at bay through existential deep-sea diving while simultaneously being careful with the scope of your claims, Philip. As grateful as I continue to be for their mentorship, I could not fully see myself as the academic I wanted to be with their two examples alone. It was in that third year that Larry Bobo came to Harvard, arriving at one class literally, I think, fresh off of his wedding. And I saw what was possible. Someone that is at once technical and colloquial, theoretical and practical, passionate and curious. And since then, bluntly, Larry Bobo has served as the de facto model for my academic aspirations, all errors, of course, being my own. Pick a question. Ask it a lot. Don't stop until your efforts bring back something useful to thinkers and doers alike. It has made the work of scholarship worth doing, and I am enormously grateful for that example. Not to overpersonalize it, but I did think it was worthy of yet another layer. I asked my wife if it was okay, and she said, yeah, this is probably not dumb. Go ahead. He might appreciate it. So yesterday, as we went to a lovely dinner, yesterday was the second anniversary of my father, Edwin Leroy Goff's passing. I do not regret the majority of the way my father and I spent our time. I tried to give him his flowers while we were together. But his passing reminded me how important it is to show people who have done great things for you what they mean. In the academy, we too often get recognized for the reach of our scholarship without acknowledging the reach of our example. So today, at an event bearing the name of someone whose life and example, Dr. Gates, are surely worthy of celebrating themselves, I think it's worth lifting up both Dean Bobo's scholarship and his example. The work his life has made possible does not end with his CV, and we are all wiser, not just for the things he has published, but for the choices he's made to make those publications and all of that work possible. Thank you, Dean Bobo. I cannot wait to hear how Afro-Pessimism fails. Please, all of you, join me in welcome Dean Larry Bobo.
My goodness, Phil, thank you so much. It's really an extraordinary honor to be here this afternoon, especially after that remarkable and deeply touching introduction, which I really had not expected. And I have to say, in looking back over the years, I have learned at least as much from Phil Goff, who was singularly the most brilliant student in 3 seminars in our days at Harvard together. So it's a double honor to be here today delivering the Henry Louis Gates lecture, a man who is undoubtedly a true genius and a historic figure and a somewhat troublesome next-door neighbor. But we will all live through that, I think. And Phil took a gamble inviting a dean to give a serious, substantive lecture because deans no longer think about deep ideas. You know, we process paper, we piss people off, and we try to solve problems. I mean, this is our charge in life. But I took this obligation as seriously as I could and tried to think in different terms than I often have. So let me just leap into this. In order to make sense of what I will argue in this lecture, it's necessary to briefly recount 3 distinct experiences or encounters with what I will treat as instances of Afro-pessimism. These encounters variously involved family, a professional meeting, and my regular classroom teaching at Harvard. I will foreshadow a bit by offering the opening framing of these encounters as bearing, at least in part, on lessons to be learned from W.E.B. Du Bois's founding work of American sociology, The Philadelphia Negro, a social study, as well as on the well-rehearsed positions in a long-standing line of debate in the social sciences generally and in African American studies more particularly. That debate can, of course, be labeled as the social structure versus culture argument. If there is a narrative thread or thesis I'm working with that organizes and drives what I want to put forward today, it's a simple declaration. It is that as scholars, social scientists, and serious students of the African American experience, it profits us not to exaggerate, oversimplify, and more pointedly, thereby misrepresent the underlying complexity of the circumstances of African Americans in an effort to achieve our aims of racial justice, equity, and a society free of the wounds of race and racism. I do believe this claim to be a meaningful observation in a wider context of discourse where the voices of many of our left-leaning thinkers are advancing Afro-pessimist stands, on the one hand, and where voices of increasingly prominent right-leaning thinkers are essentially practicing what I have termed elsewhere as laissez-faire racism. I will say a bit more to define each of these terms more carefully later in these remarks. Ta-da. The first encounter with Afro-pessimism that informed my thinking was a rather prosaic family gathering for a big annual group dinner. Inevitably, the conversation among black folks turned to aspects of what was going on with other relatives, community change, and in particular, what was happening to black folks writ large, when a cousin declared with certainty, "Absolutely nothing has changed. I don't know what you folks are talking about. Black folks are still catching hell in this country. It's always been that way and it always will be that way. Don't give me that progress crap." Well, at first I replied with a slight chuckle and commented, "You don't really mean that, do you?" The quick and ferocious expletive-laced response I got amounted to a direct, "Hell yes, I do." Some others chimed in to support this view, and most others were not perturbed by it, and were just really waiting patiently for another topic of conversation to emerge. The experience, to be truthful, left me a little puzzled at the vigor and intransigence of the declaration, but in the main, at the time, I really didn't think much more about it. At least that was true until 2 weeks later, and this picture is not literally from 2 weeks later, but I was trying to find a picture of African Americans meeting in a serious setting, but they were all of real people, and I didn't want to imply that they were victims of what I'm about to describe here, so I took a picture that actually had me in it. At least that was true until about 2 weeks later when I was attending a day-long workshop on all things how to produce a broad, multidisciplinary social science perspective on the status of African Americans. A highly respected scholar declared, much like my cousin, that, well, we all know nothing has really changed. Racism is still here and potent in America, and blacks remain basically stuck at the bottom. Aside from wondering to myself why we had gathered in the first place then, if this was all so very obvious, I had the temerity to remark that we can't really be talking about ignoring all the social change that has happened in the post-World War II era and still expect to be taken seriously. 2 to 3 other voices quickly weighed in to insist that I was clearly attaching too much significance to the superficial accomplishments like Barack Obama being elected president of the United States, or that I was ignoring or downplaying any of a variety of traumatic events like police shootings of unarmed blacks that were seemingly routine occurrences. We all concur, I insisted, myself included there, that the police involved in such heinous acts should be punished and that reforms needed to happen and happen quickly to make a swift response to such actions the reliable outcome for murdering unarmed civilians posing no threat to anyone. Yet the call for thinking of the complexity in black life across many domains, I have to confess, seemed largely to be a non-starter in this otherwise very serious academic room. For 5 years, I think it was 5 years, I co-taught Introduction to African American Studies with the man we honor here today with this lecture, Professor Henry Louis Gates. One of his lectures that I confess always troubled me to some degree, even as I learned a great deal from his analyses, involved Skip's juxtaposition of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God and Richard Wright's Native Son. I hope you recognize this. Over the course of the lecture, he places Hurston and Wright in literary, biographical, and to a degree, socio-historical context. On the literary side, he emphasizes how the protagonist, Janie Crawford, comes to speak in first-person, active voice and takes us through a life of challenge, but also of genuine self-discovery, and the first literary orgasm, I'm told, and creative realization, as it were. Then he contrasts this to the telling of Bigger Thomas's tale, which occurs in a third-person narrator voice, because Bigger does not and cannot really speak for himself as the prose manifestation of the constricting oppression and racism under which he suffers and by which he is ultimately destroyed. Skip also recounts the rivalry of the two noted authors and the sometimes bitter critiques they directed at one another, and I won't recount the rather scatological humor involved here. But this is not just an exercise in comparison and contrast. There is a multi-layered subtext here for my friend, Professor Gates. For him, it is a tale of the richness of black life in Hurston versus the drudgery of black oppression in Wright. It is a triumph of human agency and creativity in one versus the relentless, suffocating totality of white supremacy for the other. It is at bottom the joy of literary greatness of Their Eyes Were Watching God versus a writer's descent into a seemingly hopeless sociological abyss in Native Son. And at this point, I get pissed off. This latter, by the way, Skip always drives home very forcefully by showing clips from Wright's own horrible film production of the novel, which invariably draws laughter from the class. Now, does my own personal preference for Native Son make me the Afro-pessimist in the end? I think not, in large part because, unlike my friend and next-door neighbor Skip Gates, I am persuaded by Valerie Smith's take on Native Son. In her book, Self-Discovery and Authority in an African American Narrative, she argues that Wright's works, to be sure, bespeak a world devoid of options, where one's words and actions are closely scrutinized and where one feels that the future has been scripted by some other. Bigger does murder Mary Dalton and then Bessie Mears. Yes, but as Smith explains, quote, because the murder makes Bigger less fearful of the truth, it ironically enables him to understand his environment more clearly. He becomes more analytical. Instead of blotting out his perceptions, he begins to make fine discriminations. Bigger begins to look at his own life more contemplatively. He interprets what and how his life means by trying to assign value to his past actions. He concludes that the murder was a creative gesture because it has enabled him to refashion his life. Thus, even the novel, and in its style of writing, even though its style of writing may be different, it dramatically and horribly brings into bold relief the great weight of racial oppression. But Wright does not craft a tale that is devoid of a protagonist who never develops deeper self-insight and provide more social perception as well. Indeed, despite his terrible deeds, the tale of Bigger Thomas is a powerful exemplar of the sociological imagination, of that space where history, society, and individual biography meet, sometimes, unfortunately, with quite tragic consequences. Thinking through these three personal encounters with expressions of Afro-pessimism inspire and really frame for me the problem I want to go through here, and it certainly seemed to me useful to do so given the growth and popularity of Afro-pessimist reasoning. What then is Afro-pessimism? I intend to cast a somewhat broad, but I hope not unfairly capacious understanding of what constitutes Afro-pessimism and who has contributed to this line of discourse. By Afro-pessimism, I mean the view that African Americans are basically cemented at the bottom of a racial hierarchy, resulting in profound material, political, socio-cultural marginalization, if not open oppression. In its most extreme variants, Afro-pessimists contend that this disadvantaged structural placement and the ideas and beliefs rationalizing it are very deeply rooted, unlikely to change in significant ways. Somewhat less extreme versions admit of some potential for social change and improvement, but largely expect this to happen only at the margins, rather than allowing for genuine or far-reaching transformation in the social order. In this view, most outcomes or conditions that others may view as significant change are discounted as peculiar exceptions or idiosyncratic one-offs that in the end reinforce the existing hierarchy and its rationale. One more contemporary voice I'm, for the moment, going to put here belongs to Princeton's Eddie Glaude, who in his 2016 book, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, Glaude argues that the police murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, St. Louis, and subsequent social unrest is symptomatic of this situation. He goes on early in the book to castigate the paltry accomplishments of the Obama administration, whereupon he declares, quote, "This book details what I call the Great Black Depression and shows how the current rhetoric of economic recovery does not include the majority of black communities in this country. It challenges the pervasive silence about the crisis in black communities and puts forward an idea of American democracy shorn of its racist baggage. This book offers a thicker description of the current status of black America. It shows how what I call the value gap, the belief that white people are valued more than others, and racial habits, the things we do without thinking that sustain the value gap, undergird racial inequality, and how black and white fears block the way to racial justice in this country." Afro-Pessimism finds fairly direct expression in Pulitzer Award-winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson's 2020 book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. She defines a caste as involving, quote, "an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed superiority of one group as against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked groups apart, distinct from one another and in their assigned roles." She goes on to write that in particular, race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race the skin. Race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. Caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in its place. Take another field. According to my friend, political scientist Michael Dawson, a core attribute of most strands of African American political thought do in fact insist that the U.S. has not ever lived up to its putative liberal democratic ethos where blacks are concerned, and in fact is likely not genuinely fundamentally good at the end of the day. He writes, "A central theme within black political thought had been not only to challenge any such characterization of the nation's propensity for tolerance, but also to insist that the question of racial injustice is a central problematic in American political thought and practice, not a minor problem that can be dismissed in parentheses or footnotes." Now, the words racial and American in this quote I've just gone through, Dawson italicizes for emphasis, I think for the purpose of implying that blacks were never really meant to be included in the distinctly American version of the promise of a liberal democracy. Take another example. Philosopher Charles Mills, in his book, The Racial Contract, a book I love, by the way, and I assigned it as the first reading in a course early on in my career at Harvard, mostly as a provocation, because I thought it would make a strong argument that would promote discourse and debate in the class. Most of the students came back, including one young woman who's now a professor of English at UC Berkeley, who said, "Well, this book is fantastic. It's the most important thing I've ever read, and it told me everything I want to know." So this is an influential book. But he presses this line of reasoning even further. He contends that the core Enlightenment idea of a social contract was never intended as stretching so far as to include non-white, non-European peoples. Hence, what we really live under is not an all-embracing social contract of individual rights and citizenship, but a racial contract that neither aspired to nor ever intended to include blacks or other colonized peoples in full citizenship and membership. In social psychology, many of you will be familiar with the work of Jim Sidanius on his theory of social dominance. Among the foundational arguments of his theoretical model, based in an evolutionary psychology set of premises, is that once humans progress beyond simple hunter-gatherer groups, all human social systems develop into collectivities with a dominant social group or category at the top and a subordinate, or as he terms it, negative reference group at the bottom. This mode of fundamental social organization, he suggests, has been selected for through evolutionary time. Accordingly, for him, African Americans are the critical negative reference group in the American social order, and it is the evolutionary nature of things. Of course, perhaps the single most extreme variant of Afro-Pessimism comes in the work of Frank B. Wilderson III in his book aptly titled Afro-Pessimism. To wit, blacks are necessary presence but fixed at the bottom around the globe. He suggested, quote, blackness is coterminous with slaveness, and accordingly, drawing on Orlando Patterson, is essentially a form of inevitable social death, to be permanently outside the social compact and all that it guarantees to those regarded as truly and fully human. I could go on, and there are other figures and voices from different disciplines and fields of social thought, but you get the point. All the people I have listed might object to being so classified or want me to have this or that further nuance added to things, but I think what I've argued is at least serviceable to suggest that all of them embrace a deep and abiding skepticism that black people in general and African Americans in specific will ever be viewed and treated as fully franchised and embraced members of Western democratic social orders, including here in the US. Let me digress briefly for one moment to note that one might regard many of these scholars and thinkers as proponents of a hard conception of quote-unquote structural racism. And in some ways, the term fits, but I digress in order to make the point that I actually don't like the term structural racism and wish that it would be replaced with the term systemic racism. Well, why? Why does it matter? For me, structural racism connotes a degree of fixity, mechanistic operation, and deep, perhaps even adamantine rootedness. It suggests virtually no possibility for real change. Moreover, it elides a fuller consideration of the active social processes and human actions that breathe new life into racial inequality day in and day out. Hence, I prefer to speak of a problem of systemic racism. This approach opens the door, at least, to a conception of racism that is multidimensional and complex, that is deeply processual rather than static, and at least in my own view, extends the hope of a potential for agentic human change. Am I out of order here? All right. I was going to say something about Barbara Fields and how she spoke to America's tragic flaw, and the first two examples I were going to give were Derek Bell, the legal scholar and civil rights attorney, and Joe Fagan, eminent sociologist and former president of the American Sociological Association. But you now have the spirit of the Afro-Pessimism position. I want to talk now about where and why Du Bois enters this argument. And this is the place where Du Bois comes in. For our purpose today, I intend to focus strictly on his founding text of American sociology, The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899. For me, this book contains core elements of a Du Boisian approach in analyzing the black social condition. As you all know, Du Bois comes to the University of Pennsylvania to help shed light on the sense of disorder and growing social problems associated with an increasing black migration to Philadelphia, particularly its 7th Ward. He examines just about all features of social existence: the family, schooling and education, neighborhood dynamics, the types and quality of housing, crime and policing, the church and religion, individual social activities and entertainments, their leisure activities, as well as their work lives, earnings, places, as it were, the entirety of life in the social order of the growing city. Though he had literally just finished his PhD at Harvard, he crafted a work of lasting significance. In my read of his work here is the underlying sociological framework that Du Bois crafted. And so I want to start to characterize that framework that I think is clearly present in the Philadelphia Negro. First, for Du Bois, He plainly enough rejects notions that there is any natural or essential reasons for black disadvantage and marginalization. This is so in part because he's operating with the clear presumption that blacks are fully human and will respond to circumstances, both opportunities and challenges, as would members of any other group under comparable circumstances. To wit, rather than pointing to biology or the innate nature of black people or some other essential quality, he emphasizes the experience of a group coming out of slavery, servitude, and oppression. He emphasizes the demographic composition of the group at the time in terms of gender, age distribution, migration status, and so on. He emphasizes where they are in the economy and how that is affected by a variety of forces, perhaps most centrally anti-black prejudice and discrimination. At the same time, he takes great pains to document the internal resources, institutions, complexity, and dynamics of a community that is in no meaningful way truly monolithic. He also recognizes the capacity for moral agency within the black community and a will to self-determination. As such, blacks are significant, planful actors in their own development, not simply the victims of oppression. This point about internal complexity I'll say something about briefly, but it's a motif to which Du Bois returns throughout the book. I want to point out just one example of this and this multidimensional approach of his, and that concerns social class distinction. Du Bois systematically charts the distribution of black folks across major occupational groups. Let's see if I've got that here. Making clear where men and women are concentrated, especially clear that and where blacks differ from the larger citywide population in an occupational category, and how it differs by gender. And you see at the time the extent to which blacks are not in the core expanding sector of the economy, even black men. They are hardly represented in the mechanical industries and the rising era of industrialization. They're still in domestic and personal service to an overwhelming degree. He also charts income groupings within the black community, running from a very poor group, sort of at the bottom, based on their weekly earnings, all the way up to those who he characterizes as having good circumstances or actually being quite well to do. And lastly, he talks about more a sense of status within the community. Those who behave, comported, and are recognized as more of an aristocracy of sorts, a clear, solid working class, the poor, and a group he called, though it's only about 5%, the submerged 10th, a point I will return to at the end of my remarks here today. In order to forge the connection now between my encounters with Afro-Pessimism and the Du Boisian sociological framework, there is one other notion that needs some clarification here. I want to make sure, I haven't gone too long yet. That is how to come to grips, or really how to begin to deeply theorize, the heterogeneity of large collectivities of individuals on the one hand, and the observation of regularities and patterning in interactions among these diverse individuals. That is, can we really define and pursue a science of social existence? In his 1905 essay, Sociology Hesitant, Du Bois offered an unsparing critique of the early difficulty sociologists faced in trying to craft a cogent and persuasive definition of the field and a method of analysis. He noted the bewildering array of other disciplines which all had something of merit to contribute to so-called sociological analysis. From physics and biology to economics, ethnology, politics, psychology, he could go on. He takes the two early prominent figures in the time to task. The first of these is Auguste Comte, the second Herbert Spencer. He chides Comte for setting the intractably abstract declaration that sociology is about the study of society, end quotes, as such, rather than the varied constitutive parts and internal complexities. For Spencer, who expected human development and social dynamics to play out according to inevitable natural laws, that adequate systemic description would eventually come to deduce, Du Bois wrote, Spencer and his imitators have done good, inspiring, but limited work. Limited because their data were imperfect, woefully imperfect, depending on hearsay, rumor, and tradition, vague speculations, travelers' tales, legends, and imperfect documents, the memory of memories and historic error. All our knowledge of the past lay, to be sure, before them. But what is our knowledge of the past as a basis for scientific induction? Consequently, the Spencerian sociologist could limn a shadowy outline of the meaning and rhythm of human deed to be filled in when scientific measurement and deeper study came to the rescue. Du Bois, as it turns out, always trying to be the quantifying empiricist when he could. So, what did Du Bois propose instead? Du Bois insisted that sociology has to reckon with a paradox, namely that on the one hand, there is much evidence of regularity and patterning to human social life in many domains and dimensions, or as he put it then, the evident rhythm of human action. But also there is human agency and creativity, a la Zora Neale Hurston and Janie, right? Or as he put it, the evident incalculability in human action. As Du Bois explains, for sociologists, this assumption is tremendous in its import. It means that from the point of view of science, this is a world of chance as well as of law, that the conservation of energy and correlation of forces are not universally true, but that out from some unknown nowhere bursts miraculously now and then controlling energy. Or as I would frame it here, the great potential heterogeneity and creativity of individual thought and action may create and reproduce the observable regularities we see in social existence, but may also move and involve significant processes of considerable change and upheaval. Now I'm going to digress a bit more by bringing William Julius Wilson into the story. Indeed, I could and perhaps should have included Wilson too in the subtitle of the talk, I thought on hindsight. Of immediate relevance here is the 1978 book, The Declining Significance of Race, Blacks in a Changing American Institutions. Wilson's argument, you will quickly recall, rests on identifying three distinct periods, or epochs, as he calls them, in American race relations. The pre-industrial era, the early industrializing era, and the modern to post-industrial era in my shorthand. Where am I here? And for Wilson's argument, I'll skip some of this. The main point of this being for Wilson, he says we have distinct regimes of racial inequality in each of these eras. These regimes are constituted by a distinct configuration of the economy and the polity. The power of slave owners, both economically and politically, to reinforce the existence of a slave-based economy, creating that pre-industrial era. We move into the industrializing era, where for Wilson, what matters more is the industrialization and the growing power of a white working class, who can often organize to keep blacks out of unions and more remunerative lines of work. And then in the third period, he sees the fundamental breakdown in an economy expressly organized along lines of race. Now, I don't want to recount the controversies and lines of debate occasioned by Wilson's argument here, but I do want to fashion an important amendment to his approach, one that recognizes what I understand to be Du Bois's point in sociology hesitant. Namely, in a more contemporary lexicon, which I will invoke here for a moment, what matters is culture, that Wilson had not formulated in crafting his original epochs in that argument, and that culture is that spark, potential spark, because I'm also using it to identify individual thought, belief, and action growing out of cultural orientations that might lead to change. Change that can, in fact, in some ways reverse an era of progress. So, for example, I think the culture of fear of African Americans, especially in the wake of the urban rebellions of the 1960s, produces a change in the polity, increasing harsh scrutiny through police supervision and arrests that actually increases the significance of race in some ways in the era that Wilson is in theory, writing about. So you have to consider all three in figuring out distinct racial regimes, in my argument, and there are critical feedbacks among these elements. I think that's what I want to do here. Thus, as I have written elsewhere, I would largely treat Wilson's era of transition from the early industrializing era to the modern industrializing era as, at least from the vantage point of ideas and social organization, of an explicitly race-related nature, as a movement from Jim Crow racism to the current era of what I have called laissez-faire racism, from a society ordered by a belief in a biologically distinct and hierarchically ordered set of races where separation and inequality must be imposed and maintained, to one where we attribute whatever degrees of lingering racial inequality there are, not to limitations in access to jobs or education or opportunity, but to the cultural and individual shortcomings and failings of members of the group who are themselves being left behind in an otherwise free and open economy. Thus, if a group does not succeed, it says more about their behavior and culture than it does the actions and opportunities provided by the rest of society. The point for the argument today, nonetheless, is that enormous change in the degree, form, and supporting ideology of racial inequality can certainly occur and can be made to occur. To assume that matters are structurally locked into place, as much of the Afro-pessimist perspective does, just strikes me as false and as embracing a sort of defeatism I've never been able to align myself with. I will concede that even the more processual, complex acknowledging of the potential for change does not fully resolve the potential for the Afro-pessimist to challenge that the basic tilt or weight of the system remains heavily tilted toward the reconstitution of racist ideology and conditions. But I don't have time to wrestle with all that here, but would be interested in talking about it. We only need in the current moment to watch the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, of affirmative action, and now the high-profile attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and policies to observe some, if not much, of that dynamic at work. But I believe the ingredients of a more sanguine analysis and forecast exist. And now let me return here to Du Bois. To reiterate, Du Bois was a committed empirical social scientist. Certainly this was true of the Philadelphia Negro era and many years thereafter as he attempted to conduct his many Atlantic conferences. I will not attempt anything here of a comprehensive review of that. We can, however, pose what seems to me a fair question and begin to sketch the empirical elements of an answer to it. What facts can we assemble to understand the current condition of African Americans? The following slide breaks the US population by race and then by 5 household income categories. The very poor, those living at below 50% of the poverty line, are shown in yellow. The poor, who have incomes between 50 to 90% of the poverty line, in pink. The near poor, who are at the poverty line or just below 2 times the poverty level for income, are in green. The middle class, who have incomes from twice to just under 5 times the poverty level, are shown in blue. And the comfortable, who have incomes at least 5 times the poverty level, are depicted in bright orange. Visually, I think 4 things should strike you about these figures. First and foremost, there is considerably more bright orange among whites over the full 5-decade stretch for blacks than for blacks. However, second, the size of the comfortable group among blacks grows substantially. More on that in a moment. Third, a very large swath of whites are in the blue or middle class zone, but that actually appears to shrink slightly, mainly due to movement into that comfortable orange range. Fourth, the proportion of blacks at the very, very bottom is stubbornly steady, and I will return to that, and hence returning to this notion of Du Bois's submerged tenth. Let me give a somewhat more concrete gloss on these numbers. In 1970, just under 3% of whites were in the very poor category, as compared to 10% of African Americans. If we were to combine the categories of very poor, the poor, and the near poor in 1970, we get to a third of white Americans could be so classified, as compared to fully 67% of African Americans, a solid 2/3. Move ahead to 2023, the most recent data point we can show here. The percentage of white in the very poor category rose from 2.7%, roughly 3 in 1970, to 4.9 in 2023, whereas the percentage of blacks in this category fell slightly to 8.4. More telling is that the percent of whites across all three poor categories fell by almost 10 percentage points to 25.8. Even more striking, the percentage of blacks across all three poor income categories fell by 20 percentage points to 47.1%. At this point, it may be useful to consider what has taken place at the upper end. In 1970, a paltry 3.7% of African Americans were in that comfortable income category, as compared to 13.6% of white Americans. In the ensuing years, the percentage of whites in that highest income category more than doubled, rising to 34% by the end of the trend line, or more than slightly doubling. Over the same period, the percentage of African Americans in that highest income category increases more than five-fold, going from 4% to 21%. It may help, in fact, to think of these numbers in ratios of black to white, focusing on a combination of middle class and comfortable categories, those who are arguably safely distant from immediate or pressing economic hardship. A ratio approaching 0 in this graph line would mean that almost no African Americans, as compared to whites, were in that economically safe position. A ratio of 1.0 would mean that identical proportions of blacks and whites were in this broad, economically safe position. In 1970, the ratio of black to whites who were middle class or better was 0.48, suggesting that whites were slightly more than twice as likely to occupy such a position than blacks. That ratio rose to 0.57 in 1980. By 2000, it rose to 0.73. And as of 2023 data, it was 0.83, all right? So that the proportion of whites and blacks in that highest comfortable category is almost identical relative to where it was quite a long time ago. The change is not just a matter of more blacks barely edging into the middle class. Now, I want to note something here, and it's the contradictory trends that these lines ought to draw to your attention. And you could view it as pressing whites at both ends of the distribution. The number of whites in that very poor category has creeped up slightly. They're falling behind to a degree they hadn't anticipated, arguably. The number of blacks in middle class positions has increased substantially, so that whites in those roles will be encountering more African Americans in their space as well. Both ends could be feeling like something changed here and it didn't add to what I was getting. And there's a word for that. It's called Donald Trump. Let me wrap up because I've gone on for a long time here. Afro-pessimism is a serious intellectual thread today in thinking about the conditions of African Americans. It offers a profoundly dim view of the prospect for real and meaningful social change among some of its most extreme advocates. I think we have both theoretical and empirical grounds to be more optimistic and hopeful than this, without adopting a naive and Pollyanna faith in what the future may bring. More specifically, I worry that the totalizing and grim circumstances invoked in some writings, the examples I've given here from Glaude's Great Black Depression, Isabel Wilkins' Black Caste, Wilderson's Blackness is Slavery, the whole vocabulary of structural racism, call to mind the stranglehold of no options faced by Richard Wright's Bigger Thomas. There is no out that leaves one whole and prospering. And yet I recognize that we are not yet saved, that race, racial inequality, and racism are both historically and sociologically real phenomena today in our current condition. Having said that, I firmly believe that we are better off wrestling with the challenge of the complexity of our times, not invoking simplistic and monolithic claims to an oppressed status or condition. As some common sense level reason can put it, can we be persuasive in that line of reasoning when we've had 2 black chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the American military? 2 African Americans currently sit on the U.S. Supreme Court, though one of those might be a bit contentious. A 2-term African American president of the United States, Raphael Bostic, president of the Atlanta Fed, Oprah, Beyonce, Hakeem Jefferson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Robert Smith, Michael Jordan, Darren Walker, Elizabeth Alexander, Henry Louis Gates, and on and on and on, there are incredible and important pathways for blacks to move ahead, and simply putting before others a nostrum that America's permanently stamped with an inflexible racial hierarchy with blacks locked at the bottom seems to me not to serve us well, and it's part of why we're having a hard time crafting a message, a political agenda, and a mode of responding to some of the challenges of the times we find ourselves in. Thank you all very much. Oh, okay. Where did that come from? I can't really see hands out there, if there are hands up.
Questions?
There's a hand back there, yeah.
Thank you so much. How you doing, Professor?
Good, good.
Thank you for this presentation. My name is Tyler Campbell. I'm a PhD student here in the African American Studies Department. I just wanted to ask, I'm curious about why when we think about Afro-Pessimism and, I don't know, black success or uplift, if whatever you want to call it, right? Why are you thinking about it strictly, or can you help me understand why you're thinking about it strictly in the terms of economic success or growth? And why that's the avenue that you choose to go? And have you considered, I don't know, any other options or things outside of just economic growth and success?
I'm not thinking just in terms of economic success, but what I've chosen to focus on here is indeed economic in nature, but in part, I list all of these other names to talk about some of the other fields in which we have seen African Americans rise to exceptional heights, to signal that there's something more going on than just the average distribution of income here, that is opening up pathways of mobility in life that weren't there before, and signaling a degree of access and one presumes respect and regard, which are some of the other qualities I would think of as very important that have also undergone transformation. And of course, as Phil noted, I could have done more to report on racial attitude data here, but I didn't today. I didn't want to focus on that, which I think I would characterize as having shown one very optimistic thing and 2 somewhat more pessimistic things. The optimistic thing has really been no real retreat toward a defense of, overtly Jim Crow ideology. I mean, we've seen no movement back on any of that. Yet we have seen steady, persistent, and I have to say now, we have got to a point of deeply politically consequential opposition to the idea that government, especially the federal government, has a serious obligation to intervene to enhance and improve the material status of African Americans, which may someday, we might hope, be responded to by an effective and compelling push for reparations. This is happening in various localities, but I think we're a long way from seeing anything like that on a national stage. And I didn't talk about wealth, where we know the inequalities are quite gargantuan. and I think unlikely to be diminished in any huge way, though even there, I think there are signs of some progress. So I didn't mean to, I'm not trying to signal that this is the one arbiter of whether we have seen some positive change, but it didn't seem to make sense to try to go through every conceivable indicator.
Hi, Professor. I'm speaking.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Michael Mensa. I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm also a PhD student. Professor Goff is my PhD advisor. Sorry about that. My bad. So I wanted to ask, in the three or several examples of Afro-pessimism you presented, a lot of the analyses are by, a lot of what you presented were a result of retrospective analysis of what's happened in the past, not being enough for the so-called Afro-pessimists. And I'm wondering, do you see a version of Afro-pessimism that is a retrospective analysis to help people understand the enormity of the task in front of us, as opposed to reflecting a fixity that cannot be overcome in the future? And if so, how do you then frame these results where you see these progress, but you don't see parity with regard to white and black people?
Yeah, very much a fair question. And I think some versions of the Afro-pessimist argument really are extreme, and perhaps just to be provocative. I mean, Wilderson really is a pretty extreme set of declarations. And I think he wouldn't be perturbed by it. And I think there's been a tendency, even among those we would regard as serious thinkers, intellectual scholars, to want to make strong, direct messages, as you're implying, that will call people to action. But I worry if that doesn't end up in some respects cheapening discourse. In fact, I sometimes think it plays into the hands of those, as I said, right-leaning thinkers who do want to talk about agency and moral character and choice, like a Glenn Loury, like a John McWhorter, who are going to spend their time characterizing black communities as turning in the wrong direction and making bad choices. And look, there are all these exceptions, as they each would say, look at me, look at me. That we would just be I think we'd be on more solid, ultimately more compelling ground if we developed a vocabulary that let us communicate the complexity of this community. I mean, Du Bois was trying to break down the perception of a monolithic, undifferentiated, disadvantaged, intrinsically so group of people. So I don't want to say he bent over backwards, but he painted this portrait of a quite elaborate, internally complex community that has only become far more so over time. But part of what he also tried to say was, this is a group that has free will and agency and aspirations like those any other group of humans have. And that if you don't recognize this complexity, at least as an analyst, you're going to go astray. And that's what I'm trying to convey. Not that you don't want to motivate people, not that you want to give up in drawing attention to serious problems and challenges, but I don't know if we really have to oversimplify and overstate to accomplish that.
Hi, I'm Caleb. I'm a senior here in the college, double majoring in poli-sci and econ. I'm curious a little bit about this graph, specifically the drop in the black-white income ratio in the 90s for the very poor. It strikes me as somewhat counterintuitive. This is a deindustrialization, shift to service and knowledge economy era. This is mass incarceration. This is like undermining union building efforts. And so I wondered how you explain that. Is it maybe like an increase in college access through affirmative action? It just strikes me as not fitting my understanding of how the change in the economy has occurred over the past 30, 40 years.
Well, it's not a huge drop. That's the first thing. And that's part of why I returned to that Du Boisian phrase of the submerged tenth. if there is a problem here, as William Julius Wilson tried to emphasize when he turned to the truly disadvantaged, there really is a non-trivial, but it's not third, it's not half, it's not more than, but there's like a tenth of the black population that is in serious and stubbornly persistent economic disadvantage. And that ought to be of acute concern to us, I think, and more concern than I think it has been, where people are comfortable making pronouncements that make it sound as though a majority of blacks were somehow in real economic hardship at the moment, and that is just not empirically the case.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. My name is Erica Edwards. I'm a professor in the department.
Hello, good to meet you. People have been talking about you all day long
I feel
in
famous.
glowing
Thank
terms.
You. Thank you.
So you are revered, let me say that.
I appreciate that, as are you. We come to this talk in some pretty dark times, so
Yes.
I have to say that I appreciate and also a little bit envy your optimism. I guess I want to invite you to talk to us a little bit about just sort of how you see the kind of imperative of optimism in the Black Studies project today. Like, if you could talk to us just about like how you're thinking about Black Studies. And you gave us several examples of Afro-pessimist thinking, like from the dinner table to the scholars you named. Yeah. And I was struck by the fact that many of the folks you named would not be claimed. They would not claim themselves to be Afro-pessimists, neither would they be claimed by the folks who call themselves Afro-pessimists, other than Wilderson, of course, which made me sort of think that what you're naming Afro-pessimism is less a sort of specific analytic that emerges from Black studies that is kind of operable, like as a way of thinking about the world, that rejects inclusion into a social democratic order because it's neither democratic nor social. And rather, you're thinking about it as a kind of tendency that travels out of Black studies or that traffics around Black studies. And so I found that really interesting, but it really made me want to ask you what we think the purpose of Black studies is, because for the pessimists, for the Afro-pessimists, the purpose of Black studies, or the calling of Black studies, is to expose that structural antagonism that you're sort of arguing against, right? That is to expose the structural antagonism between the Black and civil society. And that's a political project, right? It's a political project that wants to call for the end of politics itself, or the end of the world as we know it. And so if we reject that claim, then what does that mean Black studies is, right? And what I hear you saying is the aim of Black studies is to rather expose the full complexity of Black life. Do we also want to call that a political project, or what are the politics of that project?
Yeah. Well, it's in part, and pardon me for being kind of hopelessly not naive on this, because it's not a claim to objectivity, but it is a claim to trying to be as scientific, as analytical, as empirically careful as one can in the declarations you make, and that the project, in a way, first and foremost, is about generating knowledge. And hopefully that by generating meaningful knowledge and deeper insight, we are better positioned to make a move toward political ends. But I would not regard African and African American studies, Black studies, as principally or centrally a political project. I do the work that I've been trained to do as a researcher and scholar, and my authority, I think, derives not from a declaration of a set of values or from the virtues of an end state I would like to see the world arrive at, but through doing that piece of work, that kind of work, to the highest standard that I can bring to it. There is admittedly an article of faith there that's tested, and of course obviously was tested over the course of Du Bois's lifetime, whether trying to produce good, strong, convincing science would move people. And we can, of course, parody that as Derek Bell does in his essay, The Racial Data Storms, right? If you've read that in Faces at the Bottom of the Well, where suddenly, each day, white people are inundated with all the facts about the creation of slavery, the exploitation of black bodies, the destruction and violence visited on black people, the magnitude of inequality. And after just being shocked by this day after day after day after day, in Bell's telling in this apocryphal tale, what happens, Phil? What happens? Nothing. Nothing happens. I'm disinclined to embrace that narrative, because where does Bell end up, having declared that racism is a permanent, integral, and indestructible feature of the American system? He goes, well, but we still ought to campaign for justice, and if nothing else, we can make beautiful music. So his next book after that was The Gospel Choir, for those of you who are tracking Bell's productivity. I think that's a very cynical place to end up, personally. And so I don't end up embracing that sort of approach. And even if I were to go back, this will be my last comment here on that, to Bell, Du Bois's 1899 Philadelphia Negro, he ends the book, and he's still a young scholar. He's quite naive and inexperienced in the world. But he's got a list of things that black folks need to do to move the arrow forward, and that white folks need to do to move the arrow forward. And they were legitimate inferences, I think, from the data he had. And in hindsight, of course, had anyone simply done those things, we'd all be in a better place. But that is a political project, to get progress toward undertaking those kind of tasks and reforms. So I don't know if that's a fully satisfactory answer, but it certainly is how I approach things. And every time I find myself trying to wrestle with this more pessimistic read on the possibilities for change, I still come away uncomfortable with the word structural, because I don't think it's just structural. It is systemic. It has qualities to it and a dynamic to it that will reproduce itself if one isn't thinking carefully about how to intervene to undo it. And part of the reason for saying systemic is to imply that it really is across domains, as many people recognize now in trying to battle inequality. Let's say you can't improve what's happening for children in a school just by making teachers change their behavior. If kids are coming from dangerous, frightening neighborhoods, if they're in homes of chaotic circumstances, if one of their parents is arrested, there are traumas and circumstances that have to influence any success that's going to happen in that classroom. So all the energy focused on a teacher doesn't deal with all that other stuff that's also attendant to the inequality that has brought someone to that circumstance. And I'm just thinking processual across domains of life, and keeping an eye on where things really are, where the opportunities are, where the real deep hurdles remain, is the approach we ought to take.
Next question. Hey, Dean Bobo, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Jorge. I'm currently a third-year PhD student in Religious Studies and African American Studies. I wanted to ask a point of clarification on Du Bois's racialist thinking, because I'm curious how you reconcile what kind of comes off as a denial of essentialist racism or racial thought more broadly with Du Bois's essay on the conservation of the races. And so it would just be nice to kind of hear you think through that.
I feel like giving you a reference. See Anthony Appiah's very first Henry Louis Gates lecture is the short answer, because even Anthony finally concedes that Du Bois was not an essentialist. even in the conservation of races. But if you want the long answer, that's it. If you could get Anthony's all right, Skip, you tell him. Oh, you have a question. But I don't read it as essentialist. And I may be giving Du Bois too much latitude in thinking that part I'm filtering it through, well, you know, he's writing this in an era where this is really pushing the boundary in an extreme way relative to what others in that time are thinking, doing, and saying. But at the same time, I accept part of the message. I think the African American experience does inculcate a message that gets carried into the world, right? I don't think that's biological. I don't think that's an ascribed characteristic. I think that's a historical, social, and cultural product of that experience. And so that's how I kind of filter the argument from the conservation of races.
Hi, so thank you for your talk. I have two questions, actually. The first is very much picking up along the lines that you've just taken us to, which is, you know, I was thinking about your attention to moral agency in the Philadelphia Negro, especially in terms of the ways that specifically Black feminist thinkers have encouraged us to think about the kind of way that cultural difference in that text gets marshaled to do a certain kind of thinking against this submerged tenth, potentially, in terms of their capacity to transcend circumstances which we might term systemic. And so I'm curious about actually your and others. So a part of my interest in this is about my fascination with your investment in sort of like what are the political commitments that engender certain habits of reading. So I'm curious, in terms of the question of moral agency, what would you say are the commitments that engender your reading of Du Bois in this way? Maybe especially your choice to read, even the choice to read The Conservation of Races as not essentialist. Like, what is at stake in that for you? And then the second question, I was thinking throughout your talk about actually Professor Gates' arrest, because it calls to mind for me the kind of stubbornness of a kind of habit of thinking that I think is not just individualistic, but it's right, there's a kind of structural antagonism that exists, I think, between the police, right, and the Black subject that defies this idea of sort of like economic progress as the solution. So I guess I would ask, like, what is the conceptual architecture that you would provide us to make sense of that encounter?
Yep. All right. Fascinating. And there were things I didn't do here. And he's very lucky that I wasn't able to load up some videos here. But on the first question, I didn't think of myself, and maybe subconsciously I did, but I didn't think of myself as bringing my own political project or agenda to reading Du Bois. I had been reading in my father's house and was somewhat familiar with Anthony's early critique of Du Bois. So that was part of the context in which I pick up and read The Conservation of Races. And so I was really asking myself the question, does this feel like an essentialist set of declarations in my reading of it? And by the end of it, I decided no, but that was in part, as I said a moment ago, granting Du Bois a little license for the era in which he's working and the extent to which he really is at variance with prevailing views, even in that essay. So I don't end up taking it as essentialist kind of with that in mind, but I didn't pick it up with an eye toward, I have to defend this. I mean, I was kind of agnostic, and I was looking to see if it had elements to it that I would clearly and unequivocally read as essentialist. And by the end of it at the time, I should go back and read it again, but it's my clear memory, I felt, no, That was not the conclusion I got to. Now, the question of the arrest of Henry Louis Gates at 17 Ware Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I feel bad here because I'm partly responsible for this event. Skip was supposed to return from his trip to China to Martha's Vineyard, but he had bought a nice gift for me, and he wanted to bring it back to Cambridge and give it to me. And I won't say what it is because it wasn't entirely legal. But
opium pipe.
But I don't think every police officer would have behaved that, in some mechanistic sense, the way that officer did. That officer clearly had absolutely no idea who Skip was. And I can tell you this by being one of the people who was at the jail for hours and who drove Skip home that
First
day.
and last.
Yeah, yeah. And we stood there, and it's just clear that whole building went, oh my God, how do we make this go away? This was a mistake. But one officer ran off, processed the paperwork, and wrote up the report over the next 3 hours. And I talked to Charles Ogletree, who was there, came out of the building. And we're like, well, why is this taking so long? And he said, they're going through all their internal review documents trying to come up with the language that lets them get away with what this guy has done. And I don't know if I can say this, Skip, but I think, am I right? Didn't they want to drop the charges the next day?
Yeah, they did drop the charges.
They wanted to drop the charges the next. They wanted it to disappear completely. That was the official institution. But the officer and his friends leaked the police report to the press so that news of the arrest got out before it could be expunged. And that's the real truth. So is there some mechanistic police going after black? No, it was this guy. Who certainly was a working class white guy who saw a black guy, a privileged middle class black guy who refused to obey his order in that moment. And he decided, right, that's it. I'm going to teach this guy. But that was that guy. I don't want to read the whole structure of black-white police community interaction into what happened in that moment, especially given what we know about the fuller context, where they were ready to let that thing go so that no one would have to live through all of that.
But can I just say, isn't the fact that they wanted to drop it when they found out who he was, like, precisely what it deserves for their analytical attention?
Well, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it. I mean, the arrest shouldn't have happened. But I think the superiors were saying the arrest shouldn't have happened. You know, this was, it didn't make sense to anybody.
One more question.
Can I ask?
And that will be yours, and then we will be able to adjourn to the terrace at the study for the reception.
Oh, okay. Larry, thank you. I thought you gave a brilliant talk, and I was deeply honored. The submerged 10th in 1899, 125 years later, it's still the submerged 10th? What's the difference between Du Bois' submerged 10th and Bobo's submerged 10th?
No, this is a serious question, and I think we need more focus on it, in fact, than we're getting in the scholarship of what is really holding back a non-trivial fraction of the African American population. And I mean, we know some of the circumstances, and some of them are big policy levers. I mean, the kind of disinvestment in the cities that began in the Reagan eras, the kind of underwriting of the suburbs that shifted a lot of potential tax dollars away from urban areas, the capacity to find money for, you know, rockets, bombs, and wars, but not necessarily investing in lots of other resources that might really make for a permanent breach. But the other thing that's happened here, and it's part of what I wanted to note, is the also slight rise in the number of very poor or submerged whites. This is part of what's happening too. So that one of the things that happened, if you remember the anniversary conference held for William Junius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged, the number of whites who live in concentrated poverty areas has risen too. That we have created an economy and an economic structure, if you will, that is leaving more and more of them behind as well. And so if you were a group that was already behind, when all these other resources and potential avenues of response are, either pulled away or not reinforced, we can see that happening. But it is not falling just on African Americans, and that's part of the dynamic that Trump is feeding on. People who did not expect to be stuck at the bottom are increasingly stuck. People who didn't think of themselves as competing with blacks are competing with blacks.
Yeah, in my native West Virginia, you could see it clearly, right? Which has, 2% black population, huge structures of poverty replicated, self-perpetuate.
Yeah.
So 125 years later, 125 years from now, will we still have the submerged 10th? Are you saying it's just a permanent fixture of the racialized economy of the United States of America?
That's a fair question, and I hate to dodge prognosticating, and I can say that I would certainly hope not, but some big political contextual changes would have to take place, including, frankly, reducing the power of Wall Street and the corporate world with respect to our tax structure and policies that we're not likely to have much in the way of redistributed wealth or a government with more resources until that happens. And there's pressure in that direction, right? I mean, the Biden administration is trying hard to make corporations and the very wealthy pay a greater share of taxes. I mean, it's obscene how the wealthy can get away with very little, at least proportionately speaking, and sometimes even in absolute terms in the taxes they pay. And maybe someday Democrats will be able to give voice to that concern rather than fear losing their rich donors. But that's one of the huge problems here. No one is taking on an economy that is still distributing more resources upward than it is down and out. And if that's the fundamental design of our economy we're all ready to live with, but we got to organize against it. And until something at that order of transformation occurs, and that we do things like, guaranteed childcare for young parents, better support for parental leaves than we have now. It's hard to see us mobilizing both the resources and the policy supports to really transform that part of the problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. Larry, thank you for this brilliant talk. I really liked your talk. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois famously wrote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And I think what happened to Skip that evening was that somebody drew the color line. Somebody drew the color line. Du Bois, in his day, the color line was bold.
I'm sorry?
In Du Bois's day, the color line was bold. Bold, it was bold. And these days, it's somewhat blurred, if you will, because of all the progress that you mentioned, that you talk about, but people do, in fact, draw the color line, in fact, because people step across it, not knowing sometimes. And the police are some of the most prominent culprits in this, the drawing of the color line. And I wrote a book published in 2011 entitled The Cosmopolitan Canopy, in which I introduced the concept of the iconic ghetto, the notion that the ghetto is no longer simply a physical space. It's become a mental construct, an icon, you see. And it's a great source of stereotype and prejudice and discrimination. And oftentimes people who are ethnocentric and not well-educated, not very sophisticated, buy into that and constantly draw that color line with respect to black-white relations, as it were, you know. And I think this officer is, to some extent, one of the guilty ones in that respect. But I liked the points you made here. And when I saw Skip in the newspaper that day, I said, wow, that picture of you, it was pretty provocative, you know?
Yeah, no, it was horrifying. And to be, I mean, I was there when his assistant called and said, you got to go to the police station now. You got to go now. And said, like, what? Hey, they've arrested Skip. And like, oh my God, sue him, And, a bunch of us are standing out there. And Skip doesn't like me to tell this part of the story, but when we got him in the back of the car, can I tell this story? Yeah, sure. He gets in the back of the car. He goes like, jail, man, prison, this is terrible. I got to call Angela Davis and apologize. I got to call her right now.
That, ladies and gentlemen, happens to be 100% true. And subsequently, we bought Angela Davis's papers for her.
Yes, with the assistance of Elizabeth Hinton, who got that going. Yeah. No, but right. I mean, but that was, no, it was bad. It was bad for weeks on end. I mean, most of you didn't live it as personally as the rest of us, especially Skip, have. I have to say, maybe my last anecdote, I will step down. So I like to say I helped arrange the beer summit. We were on Martha's Vineyard, and Skip had to terminate his cell phone contract and get a new number. And he called me from an airport and said, I'm sitting here and people are telling me that Obama has invited that cop to the White House. Did Obama invite that cop to the White House? I said, well, I don't know, Skip. Let me turn on the TV. And as I turned on the TV, my phone rang and a message came across the phone. It said, White House calling. And I thought, wow. I said, Skip, let me call you back. I think the White House is calling. And there was a guy by the name of Mike Stoudmanis, who's now the president of the Obama Foundation. And he said, Professor Bobo? I said, yes. He said, your friend Larry Parks gave me your number. And I go, okay, this is real. Larry Parks is a friend. He says, the president's trying to locate Professor Gates, and no one has a new phone number for him. And I said, well, I'm one of two people on planet Earth who have that number. Let me give it to you. And the rest is worldwide television history. In any event, well, thank you all very much. You've made me think
Thank you.
more deeply about this.